Ladies and gentlemen, I invite Professor Amartya Sen to converse with all of us and share his thoughts on the future of India and the globe.
Thank you very much for coming, and very thrilled to see people outside as well as here, and I'm really very grateful.
By calendaring in India, we really mean the Gregorian calendar, and then the official calendar, about which there is always a lot of confusion. Is it the Vikram era, the Shaka era? But we have not just these, but a whole plethora of calendars. And one of the calendars, the Bengal calendar, which is followed for all important ceremonies in Bengal, I learned for the first time, and to my great instructional delight, from Amartya Babu's essay, actually follows according to a modification caused by Akbar, and he brought it in line with the Tarikh-e-Ilahi, the year when Muhammad went from Mecca to Medina. So highly ritualized observances in Bengal are actually following a Hijri protocol, which is an extraordinary thing for us to know. But going beyond that, what does this tumult of dates and this telescoping of different attitudes and definitions of time mean for us in India? I think today we are heading a new calendar altogether. I don't know if we should give it a name, but if we were to give it a name, we can be sure that it would not belong only to that name. I'd like to hear you, Amartya Babu, on what calendars and calendaring mean to the culture of India.
Yeah, that's it. I got involved in that because I was struck by the multiplicity of calendars in here. One or two of them are very much based on imagination, like Kali Yuga calendar. But most of them are based on astronomical observations. And some of our great mathematicians, like Aryabhat, comments on the Shaka calendar already in around 499. And he talks about the nature of these calendrical connections. Of course, as you will remember, Aryabhat was also a person who believed already at that time that the sun did not go around the earth, and that it's the diurnal motion of the earth that makes the sun go around like that. It's interesting in this context that the best discussion of Aryabhat and his followers, Brahmagupta and Varahamihira, are actually in Arabic literature. Aryabhat was translated 3 or 4 times. I think Brahmagupta, I think 7 or 8 times. The Al-Biruni, who came to India at the turn of the millennium, just before that, with the conquering army of Ghazni, stayed on because he was a mathematician, he was interested in things, and then he wrote a great book. I think in many ways still the best book written about India, written about 1010 AD, before the Norman conquest of Britain. And I guess you would regard that to be an incomplete history of India. But it's a brilliant history about what's happened, and Tariq al-Hind. And he discusses the genius of each of them. He discusses, for example, Aryabhat's view about gravity, because he asks the question, if it is the case that the earth is churning, how come things are not being thrown out? And Al-Biruni said, well, Aryabhat's claim is that it's because every object attracts another object, that the earth being a rather large object compared with us, we don't get thrown out because we are pulled back by the earth. So it's one of the early discussions of gravitational forces. He similarly discusses eclipse and so on. But the thing in the context that you raised it, which is really important, is the issue of prejudice and open-mindedness. You see, because Aryabhat was the great originator of the school of thought, but Al-Biruni argues, and I think there are many reasons to think that is the case, that Brahmagupta was probably a bigger mathematician eventually. He solved many of the problems that are still regarded as very big. He was coming a century or so later than Aryabhat. But then while Brahmagupta follows Aryabhat in all his mathematical things and develops it, but he also points out, he also doesn't want to break from Hindu orthodoxy. So he says, he actually claims that Aryabhat should be denounced on grounds that he did not believe in that orthodoxy. However, he followed in mathematics Aryabhat's leadership, and indeed wrote extensively on that. But this was clearly speaking, which I think many people do, namely speaking one thing to one group of audience, another thing to another group of audience. Al-Biruni takes it up. He's writing in 11th century, as I mentioned, early 11th century, very early 11th century. And he asked Brahmagupta, he said that we recognize you are probably made a bigger contribution to mathematics than your own teacher, Aryabhat. But why is it that you denounce Aryabhat for apostasy? Because you don't give any argument, and indeed when it comes to calculating the eclipses, why is it that you follow Aryabhat's method rather than, and these are the words of Al-Biruni, rather than those whom you think it is important for you to admire and defend? That's the orthodoxy. Why is it that you don't calculate the eclipse on the basis of Rahu and Ketu and so on, rather than the mathematical calculation? And I think there's a kind of reprimand coming from somebody outside, and it's a kind of brilliantly delivered question. So that's one kind of thing, and of course each area mathematics, beginning with Buddha Nirvana calendar, which is actually turns out to be the oldest of the subcontinental calendars that survive. Kali Yuga is a matter of imagination. The great mathematician and scientist Laplace makes a brilliant point, saying that one thing that becomes clear studying Indian calendars is that this is a civilization which is much more concerned with analytical things and mathematics, and not with observations and with observational sciences. And he gives the other cultures, including the Greeks and the Chinese, greater marks for observational interest and higher marks for Indian mathematics of that period for analytical excellence. And they don't really matter whether you're getting a thing, but you have to get it all systematic. Even the Kali Yuga calendar, which is though fictitious, it turns out, beginning 4 million years ago or something, but it is the maths all tied up. It could have been a world, it's a possible world from an analytical point of view. But then, of course, it's not the world in which we live. But then if some people believe that's the world in which we live, and go on denouncing others who try to talk about the world in which we actually live, we have the replica of the debate that we are having today. The other thing to recognize, you mentioned the Bengali sun. Sun is actually Akbar's Tariq-e-Rahi. And it's interesting to see that why it falls short. You see, if you're patriotic, very patriotic Hindu, you will go to Kali Yuga. You will give, I've forgotten whether it's 4 million. I don't think it could be 4 million, but 4 crores. Enormously older. I can look it up in the book. But the oldest, as I said, is still, I think, probably the Buddha Nirvana calendar. But in some ways, and then of course there's Vikram, and then the sun behind it. a Shaka calendar behind it, on which Aryabhat is commenting in 5th century or 4th, 5th century. But the Hijra Muslim calendar is a lunar calendar, and it happens to be ahead of the Bengali Shan. The reason is that Akbar thought that for the sake of the integration that he was wanting, like Din Ilahiyah, the religious thing, he also wanted their calendrical unity, and he thought, really, solar calendars make much more sense than lunar. So he took the Hijra counting up to a date, and then converted that from that point onward into the solar system. He's doing it in 1590s, but of course, Akbar is a person I admire greatly, but he wasn't free of vanity. I remember Rodenstein commenting even about Rabindranath Tagore, one of my heroes, saying one thing that's never going to go away is great people's ability to fall for flattery. And Akbar converts that date from the date on which he ascends to the throne. So it is from Makkah to Medina, the Prophet thing, up to the time of the Akbar's ascendancy to the throne. And the Turkish ambassador and I were talking about what that date is. And then solar. Now, meanwhile, of course, the lunar, being a shorter, has gone ahead and left the Bengali sun behind, because it's going slowly turning a solar year, whereas the lunar year is going chuck much faster. So it ends up being that. I remember first doing that calculation in school. It's a very simple equation in really one unknown. You have a length of the lunar year, which is not 365, 360 days and so many hours and so many minutes. And so you have lunar up to that, and you have solar from that. So the division is A plus Vy, X plus Vy. And the division is at that point when Akbar ascends to the throne. You can easily calculate when he ascends to the throne by just comparing the Hijra calendar with the Bengali sun. It was quite fun to do. It was interesting. It was history. It was math. It was cultural multiplicity you talked about. And I think the calendars have so many different things to offer. So I must say I hope people read it, because quite a lot of work went into it, to tracing these 32 or so Indian calendars to their origin and finding out how they came and so on. The Bengali calendar, the important thing is that no Hindu ceremony in Bengal is complete without invoking the time when the Prophet went from Makkah to Medina in a mixed solar and lunar calendar. So this whole idea that there is a Hindu civilization and there is a Muslim civilization and living side by side, it ain't like that.
That was something which Cyril Radcliffe could not partition.
No, I gave the Radcliffe lectures many years later. My book on economic inequality was given by that, and I was told that he was there still. It was in Warwick where he lived, and it was Warwick University. I was giving a lecture. Actually, it began with a crisis, because like most economists, I don't have text. There's a big division between, I also am a professor of philosophy. Philosophers write up their talk fully. Economists never do. So I didn't have a talk written up. And I was being entertained by, I think, the Vice Chancellor, Butterfield. He said, I'm so glad that I had a paper in my hand. I'm so glad that you have full text and so on, because the last one who that was a very great economist and a great friend of mine, Robert Solow. He said, well, last one he came, we didn't even have a text. I didn't have the heart to tell him that I wasn't carrying my lecture with a student paper, which I was reading on the train. And I had to carry on the pretense, even at the beginning, by opening it and pretending to read it. And then I said, oh, this is really rather boring. let me get away from the script. It's not entirely the truthful story, but I think the Vice-Chancellor was happy, and at least I had not slighted the, not memory because he was alive. And then he said, do you want to meet Lord Radcliffe? And I said, well, it would be nice, he did a lot of things in my part of the world. And then he said, well, I have to check, because he doesn't actually like talking to Indians and Pakistanis very much these days. And it depends on that. And then he first said that he's offered you tea. So I came very expectant from London and went to Warwick and sat down with the Vice-Chancellor. He said, you know, I have to give you bad news, that you have to chat with me because Lord Radcliffe has changed his mind. And the tea invitation is cancelled. And so I never met the great guy who took a ruler and divided up the country into bits, sometimes predictable, sometimes very unpredictable.
Amartya, can I ask you, taking off from the calendar and Bengal, we in India are hooked on eras, and each era is supposed to be named after some great person who loomed over that era. How do you relate our sense of time with eras and heroes and hero worship? I would like, in other words, to hear Amartya Sen on the Indian fascination for hero worship.
But most of them, are they not dynasties really, like the Maurya and the Guptas and so on? I think, I think what I find particularly objectionable is to think of it as a Hindu period and a Muslim period and so on. Especially since the Hindu period is a period in which for 1,000 years, so which is the bulk of the written Hindu period, the kings were Buddhist and the country was Buddhist. So it wasn't a Hindu period, in fact. You can call it ancient period, and there are great books on that. Upinder Singh and of course Govind Thapar and so on. But you have to, it was never separated in terms of religious things. I mean, you see that when I was Chancellor of Nalanda, struck by the fact how the amalgam of cultures were really taking place. As it happens, Nalanda was established in 400 and I guess 20 AD, something like that, when and it's a Buddhist foundation, not a Buddhist university, a distinction that people find often difficult to make, because they didn't study only Buddhism. They did math and astronomy, they did biology, they did linguistics, and so on, and healthcare, medical care, tremendously. The first book of comparative medicine was written by a Chinese student in Nalanda in the 7th century, young Indian, Yijing. But the mixture of cultures is tremendous there. And I think the ancient period has that. Obviously, there is no Islam because it's not born yet. But then then there is a period when they're both happening. But you see, when Nalanda was started, the Buddhist powers were declining and the Hindu powers were re-establishing. They happily continued to support Nalanda. And that showed a degree of magnanimity that would be nice to see today. And it is, it had there was a kind of absorption of world culture, being proud of that, which is very big. I mean, the Aryabhat, Brahmagupta, when you think about it, these were inspired directly by Babylon and Greece. And there's no dishonor to note that. And to try to plant some sophisticated maths in the Vedic period is really terrible history. Vedic period had a lot of interesting riddles. I remember as a child, since Sanskrit was effectively my second language, mainly because I was so bad in English and so slow in it. the interesting riddles in Atharva Veda and so on, quite could absorb your attention. But there's no math in the way we know it, and the math really is much later. Aryabhat and Brahmagupta, 4th, 5th century, that's the time, the regeneration time. But it's directly inspired by what they're getting from the Greeks and the Babylonians. And that influence, of course, then matures India into a kind of trigonometric inventor and giant. I mean, and the transmission of scientific knowledge and mathematical knowledge across the world is brought out by some of those things. For example, I think I used in the book too, if you take a trigonometric term like sine, what's the origin of sine? After talking about the sign and effectively inventing it and showing why it's central to astronomy, Aryabhat calls it Jia. Jia is Jia Artha, meaning a radius. Diameter is Jia. Jia Artha is a radius, and if you think about your school geometry, you would remember why sine is connected with a radius. And then when the Arabs translated it actually, and through later writing, not Aryabhat himself, but Brahmagupta and Vahami and others, often shortened it and simply calls it Jia. When the Arabs started translating it, which was a couple of centuries later, and as I mentioned, they translated Aryabhat and Brahmagupta repeated, including Al-Biruni himself translated Brahmagupta, whom I referred to earlier. They translated Jia into Jiva, phonetical reason, whatever. But Jiva had no meaning in Arabic. But Arabic is not, only the consonants are specified, no vowels. So it's really JB. So the later generation of translators as well as Arab mathematicians didn't call it Jiva, called it Jab. Now, Jab is a good Arabic word, meaning a cove or a bay. And then when in 1150, Gerardo of Cremona first time introduced the notion to Europe, wasn't translating Sanskrit directly, but translating Arabic mathematics influenced by Sanskrit. He translated, Gerardo translated Jia, which was, and by then Jabe, which is a lake or a cove, a bay or a cove, into sinus, which is the Latin word for bay or cove, from which the word sine comes. This, in one word, you have Arab mathematics, Indian mathematics, European mathematics. That's the beginning of that kind of thought. And Indian mathematics inspired by Babylon and Greece. You can see a kind of circularity of movement. And it's that we have to really jealously guard and not allow ourselves to be localized and diminished.
Would it be right to say that we are in deep error regarding Sanskrit as a language which stands for a particular religious order?
Absolutely, there's no question. Well, for one thing, Sanskrit is the vehicle also of early texts in Buddhism and Jainism, aside from Hinduism. It's also error because there are different types of Sanskrit. I remember as a child I learned mostly classical Sanskrit, and I mean, my favorite writers, not only Kalidas and Sudra, but also Bhan and so on. But the Vedic is quite different Sanskrit. I could do it since my grandfather was a Sanskritist, with his help. I learned a bit of Pali, I learned a bit of Prakrit. But there are all kinds of different languages in which these things come. If we get a chance, we might even talk later about the gender inequality in India and linguistic connection. That was interesting to talk about. But the ancient culture carried all these things. Now, Buddhism went through a very peculiar thing because original texts in Buddhism are in Sanskrit, but Buddha himself, as an egalitarian, and he said something, he said that now the text should be in colloquial, which was there for Prakriti, and that people don't follow the sophisticated Sanskrit anymore. So dharma becomes dhamma and so on. And then for a while, you have to do Pali and Prakrit. But you know, it's like much later, Evan Srinivasan will write about Sanskritization. But there was a Sanskritization that took place in Buddhism. Because when when there's enormous, great philosophical works were coming out, like Nagarjuna and others, they were using proper classical Sanskrit, and Visu classical Sanskrit too. For those who are interested, I'm afraid I have a teacher in me, so I have to give you references to what you can follow up. and Bimal Matilal his Perceptions is a great book, and his followers. It's a tradition where suddenly Buddhism went from a kind of very written Sanskrit to a colloquial Sanskrit, then back again to very colloquial, very classical. Now, I talk with, I have an interest in Buddhism, so when I was visiting Thailand, and aside from visiting some of the main temples, I also tapped some of the Buddhist scholars. They're all very well versed in Sanskrit, but not so much the Pali and Prakrit, but that too, but mainly quite relentlessly pure Sanskrit. And that's the vehicle in which it's delivered. Of course, it's interesting that if you think not only Al-Biruni, of course, knew Sanskrit, but if you think about the great Arab mathematicians, if you think about Al-Khwarizmi, 9th century, writing in Arabic, I think it's Persian in origin, but his work changed is the basic foundation of many modern mathematics. The word algorithm is Al-Khwarizmi in English. His book, Al-Jabr Muqabila, is the source of algebra. But he was also a Sanskritist. So there is this kind of complete movement of ideas